Hello guys, today we're going to be looking at Saul Kripke's theory of names and necessity. Now, in 1959, Saul Kripke published a short paper called The Completeness Theorem in Modal Logic, which at first glance appeared to be a purely technical contribution to formal logic. And its philosophical significance, however, was quite enormous. Now, what Kripke accomplished when the rehabilitation of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's idea that necessity could be understood as truth in all possible worlds now rendered it with any mathematical precision. Prior to this, analytic philosophy had inherited from David Hume a deep suspicion of modality. The concepts of necessity and possibility seemed to lack any grounding in an empiricist worldview. Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, and most of the founding figures of analytic philosophy, were accordingly hostile to modal notions. Yet, ordinary discourse is saturated with claims about what must be or might be the case, and so logicians including C.I. Lewis and C.H. Langford had attempted as early as 1912 in their book Symbolic Logic to develop formal systems, like modal logics, that could handle such claims. The problem was that by this time, Kripke was writing hundreds of competing modal logic systems. Basically, he was writing against them, and they existed with no way to adjudicate between them. Now, Kripke's semantic framework resolved this by showing that different systems supply correspondence, to different structural assumptions about space of possible worlds, specifically about which worlds are accessible from which other worlds. Now, this accessibility relation, varying by the system, explained the entire proliferation of modal logics in a single unified framework. Now, 11 years later, in January 1970, Kripke delivered a series of lectures at Princeton University that were eventually published as Naming a Necessity. Now, in these lectures, Kripke turned the possible world framework towards a set of long-standing philosophical puzzles about language, in particular about how proper names work. The result was one of the most consequential contributions to analytic philosophy of the 12th century. Now, what happens is that you get into the Frege-Russell descriptive theory. Now, the dominant theory of names that Kripke set to oppose was what he called the Frege-Russell, or descriptive theory. Frege had argued that names possess not only reference to the object they picked out, but also a sense, a mode of presentation that determines that reference. Russell, in related vein, treated ordinary proper names as disguised or abbreviated definite descriptions. So a name like Aristotle would really mean something like the last great philosopher of antiquity, or the teacher of Alexander the Great. Now, the sense or description both gives the names its meaning and fixes to what it refers to. The reference is simply, however, uniquely satisfies the associated description. Now, John Stuart Mill, in his A System of Logic, had proposed a strikingly different view. For Mill, a proper name is nothing more than a tag attached to an individual. It has reference but no sense, no descriptive content whatsoever. The name Aristotle does not mean anything. It simply picks out person Aristotle in a way a label picks out a particular desk in a room full of desks. Now, Kripke takes Frege-Russell theory seriously enough to begin by cataloguing its apparent advantages over the Millian view. Three problems in particular seem to favour the descriptivist account. First, there is a question of how reference is determined at all. If a name is just a mere tag, there's no account of how we manage to attach it to the right individual, especially when that individual is no longer available to be pointed at. Now, the Frege-Russell theory answers this cleanly. The description associated with the name picks out whoever satisfies it. Second, there's a problem with informative identity statements. Frege's famous example that Hesperus is phosphorus, where Hesperus was a name given to the evening star and phosphorus to the morning star, and it represents a genuine astronomical discovery, not some trivial tautology. Now, if both names were mere tags for the same object, the statement would be uninformative, as desk 23 is desk 24. Now, the Frege-Russell theory explains the informativeness by noting that two names carry different descriptions, so discovering their co-reference is substantive in what they're trying to find. Thirdly, there are meaningful claims about existence and non-existence. To say King Arthur did not exist seems to say something coherent. On the Millian view, a name without a bearer is a tag attached to nothing, puzzling and philosophically unexplained. The descriptivist account gives a clear analysis. To say Arthur did not exist is to say that no unique individual satisfied the cluster of descriptions associated with that name. Now, this gets into Kripke's official statement and his objections. Kripke distills the Frege-Russell position into 6 propositions, which is, for every name, there is an associated cluster of properties the speaker believes the referent to have. Some of these properties are believed to pick out a unique individual, and if a unique individual or object satisfies enough of these properties, that object is the name's referent. If nothing does, the name has no referent. Furthermore, the conditional, if the referent exists, it satisfies most of these properties. It's supposed to be knowable and a priori, and to represent or express a necessary truth. Now, Kripke's verdict is quite striking, because he accepts the first claim as trivially true, but argues that every other proposition is false. His objections take several forms. The epistemic objection notes that most speakers cannot in fact produce a uniquely identifying description for many of the names they use. Right? A speaker might know that Richard Feynman was a physicist without knowing anything that uniquely distinguishes Feynman from any other physicists. Now, the name seems to refer successfully, despite the speaker's descriptive poverty. Now, if Russell and Frege's theory was correct, such names would fail to refer, which is an implausible conclusion. More fundamentally, Kripke raises what he calls the modal objection. Consider Aristotle, defined as the teacher of Alexander the Great. According to Proposition 6, if Aristotle exists, it is necessary truth that he taught Alexander. But this seems clearly false. It is entirely conceivable that there is a possible world in which it is true, and that Aristotle existed but never taught Alexander. He might have died young, or chosen a different career, or he might have even never met Alexander at all. So this description fixes the reference in the actual world, but necessity requires that the claim holds across all possible worlds. Names, Kripke argues, are not descriptions, they are what he calls rigid designators. A rigid designator picks out the same individual in every possible world in which that individual exists, regardless of what properties that individual happens to have in those worlds. Descriptions, by contrast, are non-rigid. The teacher of Alexander the Great would pick out whoever he taught Alexander in a given world, which might be a completely different person. Now, you can have a causal historical alternative. In place of the descriptivist account, Kripke sketches out what he calls a causal, or historical chain of theory of reference. A name is initially attached to an individual through some kind of grounding event, or the initial baptism as he calls it, where you have an ostensive act of naming, or an initial description that serves not to give the meaning of the name, but simply to fix its reference on the occasion. The name is then passed along through a chain of communication, which each subsequent user intending to refer to whatever the previous users were referring to. And so reference is transmitted not through shared descriptive content, but through this historical chain of usage. And this is why a speaker who knows almost nothing about Aristotle beyond the name can still successfully refer to Aristotle. The speaker is a link in a causal chain that stretches back to the original naming. The theory resolves the puzzle that seemed to favour Frege and Russell. Informative identity statements like Hesperus is phosphorus are informatively precise because the two names, though they originally designate the same object, which is Venus, were introduced through different historical paths and different initial fixings of reference. Their core reference is a discovered empirical fact, not a matter of meaning. Existence statements work similarly. To say that King Arthur did not exist is to say that the causal chain that propagates the name falls or fails to trace back to any actual individual. Kripke's naming necessity thus has accomplished two things simultaneously. It's dismantled the dominant theory of naming, the structured analytic philosophy of language, for most of the 12th century, and it's demonstrated kind of against this human inheritance of analytic philosophy, that there is a coherent, philosophically rich notion of metaphysical necessity, quite distinct from what is knowable a priori.